My friends, at the rate things are going, Iran is going to straight up disappear from the map. And no, when I'm describing this, I'm actually not exaggerating things. I am not saying anything for comedic effect or for shock factor. Iran is straight up running out of water, and this has gotten so bad that it may have to move its capital of Tehran before everything dries up and falls apart, and at the rate things are going, the country itself is about to follow suit. This is not a good situation. Over this summer, Iran's water crisis has turned into an emergency. Wells have collapsed and some reservoirs have just completely run dry. Taps would go dry for half a day in Tehran, and state media would warn that the city of around 10 million people could hit day zero, that being the point at which water resources could no longer meet demand within weeks. It is straight up running out to the point that people will not be able to get tap water, nothing to drink, everything would be gone. As these events were described, temperatures were reaching above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, air conditioners were droning on, and power cuts would follow, which meant that all those air conditioners that would have at least provided some relief were also then not working. Millions of Iranians would bake in the punishing heat. And in a rare admission of failure, the Iranian president Masoud Pezeshkian would offer 100 billion tomans, which is around $1 million USD, to anyone who could solve the crisis. But really, as it stands, my friends, only one idea that actually seems to be possible is not even really a solution, but rather a shift in demand for the region by simply changing the location of the capital, which is currently sinking into the ground. Yes, you heard me right. Looking at the entire country, some 31,400 square kilometers of land is now sinking at a rate of over 10 millimeters per year, and in many places it is significantly faster. The problem is particularly pronounced in and around Tehran, which is the capital, where it is sinking an average of 13 centimeters per year. Not millimeters, centimeters. That is almost half a foot. The main cause of this terrible sinkage is unsustainable extraction from Tehran's aquifers, which are being tapped at ever-increasing rates amid rapid urbanization. The ground-level consequences range from sinkholes just appearing out of nowhere and the ground shifting that could damage buildings and critical infrastructure to permanent damage and eventually, potentially, the complete collapse of underground water tables that will cease to exist and there are no way to actually replenish. Regarding moving the capital, President Masoud would say on Thursday, October 2nd, 2025, that he had already raised the proposal with the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, last year. He admitted that it had received a lot of criticism, but he argued that with the accumulating resource crisis, that these issues were so deep that Iran now had an obligation to shift its capital, and it had no choice but to do so. He would make further remarks on a visit to Hormozgan province, which sits on the Persian Gulf opposite of Dubai, saying, and I quote, "This region is located on the shores of the Persian Gulf and provides direct access to open waters and the development of trade and economic relations. If we have a different view of the capacities of the region, we can create a very prosperous and advanced region. It is not good enough to accept the current situation and not design a scientific, accurate, and indigenous map for the future. The problems the country is currently facing require us to direct the development path towards the Persian Gulf. Tehran, Karaj, and Kazvin are currently facing a water crisis, and this crisis cannot be easily solved." End quote. Just to give you an idea of how bad things have gotten here, my friends, last year rainfall in the region was 140 millimeters, which is nothing. The standard in the area is 260 millimeters, which is already quite low in the first place, but that means rainfall has fallen by around 50 to 60%. This year, the situation is just as critical. Some recent estimates will put the rainfall in 2025 at being below 100 millimeters. Now, Stack, you may say, this is a drought to be sure, but of course that can't be enough to cause the entire country to dry up so quickly, right? And yes, if you ask that, then you are indeed right. That is absolutely true. It is way dumber than that. Way, way dumber. The entire modern history of Iran and water is just one giant dumb events in history, I swear to God. Iran is facing an escalating water and electricity crisis that has been decades in the making. Despite having vast oil resources, gas, water, at least in certain regions, chronic mismanagement under the clerical regime has left rivers dry, aquifers left with nothing in it, and power plants that are absolutely falling apart with blackouts routinely taking place and nothing that can be done about it. Today, over half of Iran's dams hold less than 40% capacity. While rolling electricity outages disrupt daily life and industry, meaning that the economy, people, and everything else suffers at the same time, the nation itself is falling apart. And one of the worst parts about this? The problems are primarily within the last century. For millennia, qanats, which are ingenious underground aqueducts, would balance survival with scarcity across the central plateau of Iran. Iran is naturally very dry, and these techniques were used for literally thousands of years to support the local population. But those traditional systems are collapsing alongside the aquifers, and ancient settlements in Yazd in central Iran, Kerman in southeastern Iran, and Khorasan in northeastern Iran have been pretty much abandoned as the traditional qanats have dried up. Aquifers have caved in, and the land is turning into desert. If you go and look at satellite imagery of Iran and its transition over time, you would see from the mid-1900s massive amounts of green bloom as varying different agricultural fields were set up, and those fields are now turning into desert. Satellite imagery shows entire farming communities that have disappeared because their groundwater sources have completely failed. As for the cause of that, well, successive Iranian rulers have believed for decades that dams, deep wells, and interbasin transfers would simply be able to outsmart nature. But the mismanagement of resources by the Islamic Republic would compound the crisis, reducing one of the oldest civilizations in history to now the point of collapse. I am not kidding when I say this here, my friends, but it is very possible that within the next decade or so, we will actually begin to see the first water wars in modern history take place, with Iran, Afghanistan, and other states being the first belligerents. So of course then, the question, as always here on the History of Everything, is how exactly did we get here? What is going on now, and what is going to happen next? Well, sit back, my friends, and let me tell you the story of how one of the most corrupt and incompetent regimes in history would manage to destroy its own environment and bring about what seems to be its own destruction. Yeah, it's just one of those things, my friends, that the longer that I do this job, the more that I feel like this shirt of mine becomes significantly more relevant, and I genuinely do wonder how long as a species we are going to last. But hey, if something does happen to us, at least we have record of everything that we have done, good and bad, which is actually why I have the last book. Go figure, it's called The Last Book. This is a diary that is describing the entire story of humanity and the cosmos in one massive, beautifully illustrated book that covers the entire story of humanity and everything good and bad that we have done, which is a lot. We have done a lot of things. I'll stress that right now. To exploring the age-old question of who exactly was here first, what exactly heaven and hell are, and even the weird little history of how the lobster went from trash to being fine cuisine. There's all these little details in this encyclopedia, which that's exactly what this is. This is both a diary and an encyclopedia in one, covering our whole everything for humanity and the cosmos, which I find absolutely fascinating. And I genuinely think if you are a person who enjoys books, if you like reading, if you are just interested in having a kind of object that you can either give to someone as a gift or have on your coffee table for people to peruse while it is that they come to your house, this is genuinely one of the best things that I could recommend. If you have a friend or a family member, or you yourself might be interested, you should definitely click my link down in the description and use my code, which you can see up here. But hey, if the Earth is destroyed and this is the story of the last Earthling, let's get back to the show and see how it is that we actually got to that point in the first place. We're probably screwed. We are going to rag on Iran a lot in this video, and you may not believe it, but I'm actually being generous and trying to stay neutral when I describe this. The criticism is just that obvious that needs to be made. To begin, we need to clarify a few things about the status of Iran today in comparison to its past. We already mentioned in the beginning of the video the traditional methods of storing and utilizing water that have been in place for thousands of years, but this was not really an issue with water until very recent times, like within the last century. As such, we don't really have to go back too long of a ways, but I will provide a little bit of an overview because naturally that's what we do on here. Iran, for anyone who has not seen images of it before, is a very mountainous, arid, and ethnically diverse country of southwestern Asia. The country maintains a rich and distinctive cultural and social history dating back to the Achaemenid period, which began in 550 BC, with varying different ethnic groups, religions, and empires rising and falling throughout the region over the course of the millennia. The reason for so much diversity, as well as so many powerful empires, is because of Iran's geography, the very thing that is working against it now. Geographically, much of Iran consists of a central desert plateau, which is ringed on all sides by mountain ranges that afford access to the interior through high passes. As a result of this, the majority of the population lives on the edges of the waterless wastes. But still, despite harsh conditions, people would thrive. This was the heart of the ancient Persian Empire, and Iran has long played an important role in the region as an imperial power, And later, because of its strategic position and abundant natural resources, especially petroleum, this has been a factor in colonial and superpower rivalries for literally centuries. But that, my friends, is all that we're going to be doing here for an overview. We have to skip forward by a large amount of time in order to be able to get to modern Iran. The reason for this is because, again, truthfully, it was not until the 19th and then 20th century that the problems that we see today really began to take root. And I mentioned the 19th, it is pretty much almost exclusively the 20th century that is the cause here. The reason for that is that the history of modern Iran and its water troubles begin with the Pahlavi dynasty, which ruled from 1925 all the way until 1979. This dynasty was founded by Reza Shah, a former army officer who seized power in 1921, and he would go on to implement a series of modernizing reforms, including the creation of a modern army, expansion of education and healthcare, as well as the development of infrastructure. Lots and lots and lots of infrastructure. That's an important detail to mention here. Along with this, he would also promote the use of the Persian language and culture and sought to reduce the influence of foreign powers in Iran while propping himself up. At the same time that he took power, the population of Iran was only around 10 million people, which I gotta say, keep this number in mind as it is extremely relevant for the future because the current population of Iran is around 90.5 million people. That is a 900% increase alone, while the capital by itself of Tehran sits at 9.8 million people today. And the greater metropolitan area, if you want to look at the area that is around Tehran that people would still kind of call Tehran, that is an area that has 16.8 million people. So yeah, the capital of the country today has half again as many people as the entire country did 100 years ago, which would, as you can imagine, put immense strain on water resources in a country that is already quite dry. The projects that Reza Shah would launch, though definitely enriching the country and state, would also drastically increase water usage as intense focus was placed upon cash crops such as cotton, which is a very water-hungry plant, as well as concrete for industry. Again, something that also can use a heavy amount of water. In 1941, Reza Shah was forced by Britain and the USSR to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, due to his perceived closeness to Nazi Germany back during World War II. But after this war, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi would continue his father's modernizing policies, and at the same time would face opposition from the Communist Tudeh Party and the Nationalist National Front. In order to be able to deal with these varying entities and bind the people to him, he needed to do things personally, and one of the key ways that this would be done is with infrastructure. In the year 1949, Pahlavi would visit Las Vegas and would even go and see the Hoover Dam, marveling at it. The Shah was enthralled by these massive colossal structures as being symbols of not only the state, but symbols of control, modernity, and power. So it was then, over the course of the 1950s and 1960s, that the United States and the Soviet Union would compete for influence in Asia and Africa, packing their ideological visions of economics and politics into project developments all across the regions. In the case of Iran, loans and technical assistance in dam building and hydraulics were offered, and Iran would jump at the chance, never looking back again. We will see here later why they may have been a little bit overzealous, to put it mildly. Fast forward a bit, and in the 1950s and 1960s, Iran would experience rapid economic growth, driven by the oil industry and foreign investment. The country became a major player in the global economy, and the Shah's government would go and implement a series of development plans in order to modernize the state. President Harry S. Truman's four-point plan had offered the Shah technical assistance, sending American engineers to train Iranian specialists and transferring modern irrigation and drilling technology. From this, they would be able to introduce deep well drilling equipment and powerful pumps that would enable Iranian farmers to drain aquifers at unsustainable paces. The Shah would place water-hungry industries such as steel and petrochemicals in Iran's driest central plateau in Isfahan and Fars provinces, tying development of heavy industry to regions that had no water of their own and were dependent on diversions from other basins. But this didn't matter because he was doing it for his own power as well as modernization. Following this, massive land reforms in the 1960s and 1970s during the White Revolution, as it was called, would further develop industry and boosted agriculture while largely ignoring hydrological concerns that were steadily building in the background. To understand what it is that I mean, in the year 1963, the Shah would introduce land reforms to modernize the countryside by redistributing large estates to small farmers. breaking up control of feudal landlords and promoting mechanized farming with state credit. Farmers would be able to get their land on loan and would be able to get modern equipment necessary for said land on loan, but the majority of these guys didn't necessarily have business sense, as they had never really been independent farmers before. More than 2 million peasant families were given land, and at first this does sound awesome. The reforms did hasten the break with traditional systems, both in the sense of politics, where the old feudal structures and clergy were weakened in order to create a new class of independent small farmers that were loyal to the Shah, and also traditional farming methods were abandoned, with many farmers leaving the ancient qanats behind for motorized modern wells. Again, it doesn't necessarily sound too bad on its own, but the Shah's failure to provide support to the peasants led to their farms largely failing, and sent waves upon waves of impoverished migrants to Tehran and other Iranian cities, many of whom would later fuel the 1979 revolution, which we will get to here in just a second, but we have to address the mentality that Iran has had towards water and resources, because that is crucial to understand why any of these things have happened. You see, Iran's plans for development did not really count water as a major limitation to population growth. In fact, Iranian leaders under the Shah and then under the Islamic Republic both thought that, they could simply just buy technology to overcome the shortfall in water resources. After all, we live in the modern day and age, so you can just bypass any kind of concerns. This exact same mentality and problem is something that is very common across the Middle East, sadly, and we see it to this very day. I have to do a follow-up on Saudi Arabia and all the crap that they've been doing with their varying different projects. Anyway, under the modernizing but oppressive Shah, things were about to really hit the fan. In 1978, a series of protests and demonstrations would break out across Iran, calling for the Shah's overthrow and the establishment of an Islamic Republic. The protests were led by a coalition of opposition groups, including the National Front and Tuda Party that we spoke of before, but more importantly, the Islamic clergy. In January of 1979, the Shah would flee the country, and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a prominent Shia cleric, would return from exile to become the leader of the revolution. In doing this, Khomeini would go and establish a new government based on Islamic principles and began to implement a series of policies aimed at creating what he saw as a more just and equal society, but it was one that was specifically rooted in hardline Islamic tradition. The time of decadence under Western imperialism, that was over. After the fall of the Shah in January of 1979, the nascent Islamic Republic would denounce his aggressive modernization drive that was inspired by the West. In November of 1979, radical Iranian students would seize the US embassy in Tehran, demanding the Carter administration extradite the Shah, who had been granted asylum within the US. President Jimmy Carter would freeze Iranian government assets in the US and would impose a trade embargo on the country, which in turn would be the beginning of a very long and tense relationship with the state. Almost immediately, the economy went completely belly up, and chaos reigned supreme. Something that Iraq under Saddam Hussein would try to take advantage of, leading him to launch the near decade-long, horrifying Iran-Iraq War in 1980. Which, honestly, that needs to be a whole podcast episode by itself. Of course, for you who's watching this right now, you may be wondering, okay, so they did all these things, how does that relate to the water crisis, you may ask? Well, and I say that both as a transition and also a pun, the new Islamic Republic faced intense pressure to feed its people. Food rationing was introduced to make this possible, but times were still very hard. To combat this, Ayatollah Khomeini would champion self-sufficiency and food sovereignty. Almost overnight, the number of wells in Iran would double. Remember how I said once Iran started on these water projects, they never really looked back? Yeah, before 1979 and the revolution, Iran had just 14 major dams and fewer than 80,000 wells within the country. But in 3 years, the number of wells had doubled, and the new government was planning hundreds of dams. How would they do this, though? With the military. Engineers in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, became involved in infrastructure development and water resource management during the Iran-Iraq War. But following the conflict, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, would create Qatam al-Anbiya, which is the construction arm of the IRGC. Along with this, SEPSAD, which is Qatam al-Anbiya's dam building arm, would be created in 1992. The aim of these organizations was to try and create jobs for IRGC engineers, the people that were the most ardent supporters of the revolution and government, and simultaneously were typically the most educated as they had access to the greatest amount of resources within the regime. From this, they would supply resources for a drive for reconstruction under the administration of Iranian President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. Along with this, you had the creation of the Water and Power Resources Development Company, the IWPCO, a state-owned enterprise founded by regime insiders. That's an important detail to mention here. And there was also Mahab Gods, which is an incredibly powerful and very opaque consulting firm run by, again, regime insiders, which would be the people that would draft the studies for dam projects and lobby for their approval. The relationship between these varying entities was a kind of Trinity closed loop. The IWPCO would commission the dam building projects based on outdated Western blueprints and without any environmental safeguards. Following this, Mahab Gods would lobby for the construction of the dam, and then Katam, the IRGC engineering wing, would walk away with the construction contracts, making millions, if not billions of dollars. From this collaboration would emerge Iran's water mafia, a cartel of ministry officials, politically connected consultants, IRGC contractors, and of course their allies. No one could challenge these guys, and as a result, dams and water diversions became engines of patronage, enriching insiders, killing rivers, and extracting massive cost from rural communities. Projects would be approved without any kind of review process whatsoever, or if they were reviewed, none of it was done properly. They would always cost way more over budget than they were supposed to, with insiders going and splitting up the additional funds between themselves. And from this, hundreds of dams would be built, all without environmental safeguards, with Iran then becoming the third largest builder of dams in the world. Funniest part about all this, the term for this whole thing, and I'm not kidding when I say this, was Reconstruction Jihad. Like literally, Reconstruction Holy War. Which does not sound like a phrase that I should honestly say here on YouTube, but that is how it was described. You can probably see where this is going. As I said from the beginning, Iran never stopped building, even when it was not practical or even viable to continue. The water mafia would lobby for new dams, while most of the existing ones were not functioning at full capacity in order to provide the illusion of productivity and increasing value. It did not matter that one dam was only seeing 25% of the anticipated usage. They could easily build 3 more and say, hey, look at us. Look at how much we are doing to build for the country. Look at how great all this is and how great we are. Yeah, imagine all the Belt and Road projects of China with bridges, roads, and railways to the middle of nowhere that served little purpose except to build something, but all within the same country and surrounding water. As Issa Kalantari, the head of Iran's Environment Department and a former Minister of Agriculture, would admit in 2018, quote, "We made these mistakes in the 1980s. Then we came to realize that in places that we'd built dams, we shouldn't have built any. And in places where we should have built dams, we did not build any." End quote. That right there is incredibly damning. But what do I mean by any of this? Well, I mentioned it before in a previous video that I did talking about Iran's water crisis and corruption, but as just one example, the Gotven Dam, which was completed in 2012 in Khuzestan, was built on salt beds that made the water of the reservoir unfit for irrigation. Because go figure, you had salt water, and now that is obviously something that can't be used for agriculture, which was the very purpose of the dam and making the reservoir in the first place. Virtually all environmental experts would agree that this project was just a massive engineering mistake. It was incredibly stupid and never should have been done. It made no sense. But the government just downplayed the impact. Despite downplaying it, though, what the government couldn't really hide was the straight-up disappearance of Lake Urmia. In a situation that is similar to what the Soviet Union did with the Aral Sea, the Iranians would destroy what was once the largest lake in the entire Middle East. You see, in the modern era, Lake Urmia would undergo massive changes, with the construction of dams, canals, and other infrastructure altering the lake's hydrology and ecosystem. The lake's water level began to decline in the 1960s with the construction of the Sahi Dam and the Zarana River, which reduced the amount of water that was flowing into the lake. More and more water sources were siphoned away to fuel intensive agriculture efforts, and as a result, the lake's surface area would decrease by approximately 20% between 1960 and 1990, with the lake's water level dropping around 2 meters. The decline of Lake Urmia would accelerate in the 2000s, with the lake's water level dropping by over 5 meters between 2000 and 2015. So in 15 years, half the amount of time, it sank at over double the rate. The lake's surface area would decrease by approximately 80% during this time period, with the lake's ecosystem collapsing as a result, and many species of plants and animals becoming extinct or endangered. The exposure of the lake bed led to the release of salt and other minerals into the air, causing soil salinization and reducing agricultural productivity of the surrounding land, hurting the very thing that the water had been siphoned away to do in the first place. It was meant to provide water to land, to the agriculture, but the agriculture was getting blasted with salt, thus ruining it all. Along with the destruction of crops, the lake's decline would lead to the release of toxic dust into the air, causing respiratory problems and other health issues for local communities after it devastated their economic viability, destroying their fishing and tourism industry and just about any other kind of economic activity that you could imagine, except maybe salt mining, because that's all that was left. Protests by locals, social media campaigns, and photos of marooned ships and shuttered motels would help to build public awareness of the severity of the problem. And as a result of enough of a stink being raised about it, President Hassan Rouhani's government, which existed from 2013 to 2021, began to try conservation efforts, but that did not result at all in what was promised. The restoration of the lake has not happened. Billions of dollars have been spent at this point for literally nothing. Oh, and I should go ahead and actually clarify something when I describe all this. The original cost of the dam that did all of this was supposed to be around $1.5 billion, but by the time that it was completed, it had managed to cost over $3.3 billion. Think about that here for a second. Now, I am no architectural genius, my friends. I'm definitely not, but it is a true statement in history that budgets for major projects are usually exceeded by companies and governments because of delays, additional unanticipated cost, price fluctuations of material, etc. This is a natural thing that does happen in history. But what you usually see is, oh, here's a project that is supposed to cost $1 billion, and it ended up actually costing 1.3 or 1.4. Yes, that's a pretty hefty increase, but what it is not over double what it was supposed to cost. This was 1.5 billion to 3.3. All of that extra money that we're talking about here went right into the hands of corrupt officials and contractors that were affiliated with or part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Because of course. On top of all that, they had nothing to show for with this dam. But even as policymakers were becoming more and more aware that, hey, these dams are actually having undeniable consequences that we can't just hide anymore on the environment and the population, that doesn't really matter because Iran continued to build, either prioritizing ideology over basic science and understanding, or just giving into corruption because members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard were involved in these projects, and if there is one thing that you cannot do, you cannot cross the guard. Not to mention, dams were actually only one part of the problem. They were not the only thing. Less visible than dams, but even more destructive, was Iran's groundwater reserves being drained away at alarming rates since 1979, with the steepest declines in the past 2 decades alone. The regime's food self-sufficiency push would encourage the expansion of irrigation and widespread drilling of wells across the plains. Today, as it is, over 75% of Iran's land area is experiencing extreme groundwater overdraft extraction, far beyond natural recharge. It literally cannot replenish fast enough. A 2018 study would estimate that 74 cubic kilometers of groundwater were depleted between 2002 and 2015 alone. As aquifers would collapse, fertile plains would subside, and deserts would spread across the land. All of this was justified in the name of self-sufficiency, food self-sufficiency. Interbasin transfers would create the illusion of abundance because water could pour into an area fueling crops that normally would never have been able to sustain it. Rain-fed fields and arid areas that relied on dry farming for centuries were converted to water-intensive farms for growing rice and alfalfa. But all of this that I'm describing here was only a temporary boost in productivity, as we see now. It was completely unsustainable. The level to which, though, is genuinely quite shocking. If you go and look at the use of water within Iran, agriculture consumes around 90% of Iran's water sources, often with very inefficient methods. Traditional water-saving practices have been abandoned in favor of thirsty crops like wheat, rice, sugar beet, alfalfa, and more. sometimes in arid zones that are completely unsuited to cultivation that you wouldn't normally be able to use at all, but they have. This shift was fueled not only by farmers' choices, but also by politically connected megaprojects that would make this viable, at least in the short term. One example is Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's 1996 550-hectare project in Khuzestan and Lam, which would seize vast tracts of land and divert Karun River water to industrial-scale farms controlled by regime-linked institutions. While marketed as boosting agriculture, the project would do nothing more than accelerate regional drought, displacing locals and funneling profits into elite networks that were able to actually profit from it. By 2018, the second phase's cost alone had ballooned to 20 trillion tomans, deepening its economic and environmental toll. To put this into perspective so you understand what it is that I'm talking about, inflation is so bad in Iran that their currency, the rial, is oftentimes measured in toman, which are 10,000 rial. 10,000. And this is 20 trillion of that, which in US dollars is technically now around like $210 million, but also the inflation rate of Iran has been between like 30 and 50% annually, which makes it insanely hard to track or make sense of. Genuinely, I need to do a full video on the Iranian economy because the whole thing is like a giant stock market scam. It is terrible. Anyway, in the late 2000s, as the climate would warm further and things would continue to dry up, President Mahmoud would loosen restrictions on well drilling and start another dam building spree. Policies that were supposed to appease farmers would instead destroy their land and water sources. These farmers, once proud of living and working their ancestral land, were driven into poverty and forced into shanty towns. By the summer of 2024, more than 10,000 villages in Iran had no access to drinking water. A broader water crisis was affecting some 27,000 villages, stripping the residents of any kind of ability to work. They had no status. They had nothing. But still, the water mafia would just continue to build dams that would never fill. Plains would sink as water tables fell, mostly from the 1990s, and fertile lands would turn to dust and desert. Aquifers could be recharged on modest budgets through flood spreading and rainwater harvesting that had been proven effective in countries like India, but these kinds of solutions that were nature-based were more oftentimes dismissed in favor of massive multi-million-dollar contracts that were granted to regime insiders that would, can you guess it? Build more dams and divert more water sources. The Iranian government would straight up just look the other way, while some lawmakers would align themselves with the water mafia's agenda, raking in millions of dollars. You remember how I said here before how wells within Iran had doubled from like 1979 to 1982? Well, the number of registered wells would nearly double again from 460,000 in 2002 to 794,000 in 2015. With thousands of more illegal wells that were simultaneously operating by those who had the protection of the regime and could simply pay a bribe for the government to look the other way. By 2021, officials admitted that uncontrolled drilling had brought Iran, quote, rapidly approaching water misery, end quote. In other words, a point of no return. As this happened, people began to get very angry. And in places like Isfahan, where the Zayanda Rud would vanish, tensions would erupt into water riots, with farmers accusing the IRGC's water mafia of diverting water to try and fuel industry, sacrificing their fields, and as a result of this, these farmers would go and damage pipelines in protest. The crisis would pit provinces against each other. Isfahan's farmers would demand water for crops, while Yazd residents would rely on trucked water for drinking, and as a result, no one was really happy. Both sides needed it, but there was only so much that could go around, turning a resource challenge into a social conflict that would pit cities against cities, tribes against tribes, and even families against families. And honestly, my friends, do you know what may even be more insulting than anything that I have described from all this? Even now, despite all the diversion and pumping and everything that has been done, the water crisis does not have to be this bad. But it is this bad specifically because of poor infrastructure. Not only are these dams shoddily built and in terrible places, but even the pipes that transport water are so poorly built and maintained that it is estimated a third of all water being pumped is wasted by leaky pipes. A third. That is negligence of the highest degree, and it is multiplied by other aspects of Iranian infrastructure as well. Because water isn't the only thing that Iran is suffering from. Alongside this crisis, Iran's electrical grid is collapsing after decades of underinvestment, sanctions, and regime mismanagement. For years after 1979, electricity expansion would rely mainly on state-funded oil and gas plants, plus, some of the hydro plants when you have all these dams that are being thrown up, but primarily it's oil. But maintenance and upgrades wouldn't really take place, to the point that by the 2010s, a lot of these plants were aging and ineffective, operating below capacity, with around 13% of the total generated power being lost to both technical issues and just straight up theft as people are taking it. With demand inside of the Iranian state rising around 4% annually as the population grows, reaching 292 terawatt hours in 2022, supply was naturally going to fall short. By summer of 2024, Iran faced a 14,000 megawatt shortfall, or around 15% of peak demand, double the entire capacity of neighboring Azerbaijan. They did not have enough electricity that gap could have fueled the entirety of the country of Azerbaijan, and they just straight up didn't have it. The winter of 24 to 2025 was incredibly harsh, as a severe cold snap would cause natural gas shortages for both heating and power generation. This would in turn trigger rolling blackouts in up to 30 separate provinces. Even the capital of Tehran, the heart of the government, would go dark for hours, and streetlights were turned off at night in order to try and save power. Desperate measures to bring the power back on included burning something called mazout, which is heavy fuel oil in power stations, something that is incredibly dirty and toxic, which would blanket cities in toxic smog. As one lawmaker would call it, quote, an order to kill people, end quote, due to the sheer amount of health risks that are present from doing this. The state simply cannot keep up. Gas production does remain high. It is one of the key things that keeps the Iranian economy going, but it cannot meet domestic demand and export commitments, partly due to sanctions blocking new development. Years of failing to add the required 5 gigawatts of new capacity annually would leave plants underpowered and continuously drained of resources. Privatization of state-owned facilities would occur in the worst way, with facilities like Abadan and Zagros plants being handed to regime-linked entities, which in turn would pocket the profits while letting them decay, not doing anything to support them. The state is incredibly corrupt, as I've already mentioned in here multiple times. By late 2024, the problem was getting so bad that basic functions for society could not continue. The government would begin to order schools, offices, and even banks to close on extreme weather days to reduce energy use. Officials would warn that Tehran could face 4-day work weeks in summer if consumption wasn't cut, which at first, you're looking at it, that sounds amazing. Hey, they're saying, all right, everyone's going to work 4 days. But that also means that productivity is going to drop, and there's going to be even less money. And if even the oil workers are working less days, then that means less oil is being produced, which is the thing that is needed to keep the power plants running. Oh wait, that puts us right back into the same position that we were, except worse. Yeah, that really wasn't going to work, and people were getting really pissed off, especially after information came out that despite domestic shortages, electricity exports would rise by 92% in early 2023, seemingly for the purpose of getting revenue or for political leverage by exporting electrical power in order to be able to subsidize varying different foreign entities or to sell it off for money. Iran was leaving ordinary Iranians enduring blackouts. Not a good look. Even while Iranians were enduring water rationing and electrical blackouts, the regime would channel their scarce resources into ventures that would serve their political and financial interests. One of the most damaging of these is state-sanctioned cryptocurrency mining, which I cannot believe that I'm talking about cryptocurrency while going into this, but this is actually an important aspect of how Iran makes its money. It would legalize crypto mining in 2019 and would grant ultra-cheap electricity on condition that the proceeds of that crypto mining would flow into the central bank. The sector is dominated by, as you can probably guess, Revolutionary Guard-linked operators, as well as Chinese partners that run massive farms within the state. In fact, one site in Tehran alone reportedly consumed as much power as 11 entire provinces combined. To understand the level of how bad this was, you need to understand that by 2021, Iran accounted for approximately 4.5% of global Bitcoin mining. diverting 600 to 2,000 megawatts from the grid, up to 20% of the entire power deficit during peak demand in order to be able to mine crypto. When authorities would briefly shut down 900,000 illegal devices in 2023, national power use would drop by 2,400 megawatts overnight, proving just how massive of a drain this was on resources. For the public, it has meant even longer, more frequent outages, while the regime would go and pocket untraceable revenue from Bitcoin, which in turn would prompt chants from the public such as, "We sit in the dark so that they can mine Bitcoin." I can't even make this up. Along with crypto farms, the regime would go and protect heavy industries that devour water and power. Revolutionary Guard owns steel, cement, and petrochemical plants, which are often situated in arid sites like Yazd, Khuzestan, and Isfahan, as I've mentioned here before. They receive priority over farms and towns because, quite frankly, they make a lot more money. Farmers accuse them of monopolizing rivers such as Karun and Zayanderud, leaving agriculture to collapse in the areas. These industries consume around a third of the country's entire electrical output, comparable to all residential use, and were long shielded from outages until the crisis became too severe to actually spare them. They were being prioritized by the regime. Even more insane, though, is that despite everything that I've listed here, despite all these problems, despite the outages, despite the shutting down of industry and work, Tehran hasn't stopped building. They continue to expand petrochemicals, steel, even uranium enrichment, all while pouring tens of billions of dollars into foreign proxy wars. And because of the strategic nature of these industries, things like the Natanz and Isfahan nuclear sites, as well as numerous steel plants, these were built deep within the mainland in order to be able to protect them, far from any kind of open water resources, which would force them to draw heavily from Iran's limited rivers and aquifers, which would only accelerate the depletion of already scarce resources. Which has not been good. I know I sound like a broken record when I say that, but it has not been good. Iran's problems of water and power crises, these have taken a severe toll on society and the economy. In recent summers, urban neighborhoods would face daily water cuts or low pressure. By mid-2025, rationing would begin in Tehran and other cities, even before peak summer. In some high-rises, water was incapable of reaching the upper floors, which would force residents to have to go to the bottom to draw water in buckets and carry it back up to their top-floor apartments. And that's just the cities. Rural areas have been hit even harder, with hundreds of villages now relying entirely on tanker trucks after their wells have run completely dry. Agriculture has suffered massive losses, with rice paddies, palm groves, and other crops in once fertile areas like Khuzestan withering away. This doing nothing more than driving food insecurity and inflation as domestic output crashes and imports rise. To get an idea of just how severe all this is, the Iran Chamber of Commerce would estimate in 2023 that power outages alone caused nearly 18 trillion tomans in daily losses, or around $200 million. Over half in the industrial sector alone. Frequent factory shutdowns in 2023 to 2024 would leave tens of thousands of workers unemployed, at least temporarily, while small businesses, whether this is in the form of craftsmen or welders or some other kind of worker that would normally utilize electricity, such as tech startups, all of these have been made impossible to continue by unpredictable power supplies. The economy, quite literally, cannot function. Public health has also at the same time deteriorated. In Khuzestan in 2021, tap water in cities like Khorramshahr would turn muddy and salty, triggering protests. Contaminated water and poor sanitation would fuel spikes in gastrointestinal illnesses. Blackouts would disrupt hospital equipment that could no longer function, and cold chains for medicine that would go bad, putting patients at risk. In extreme heat, lack of cooling would cause heat stroke. In winter, gas shortages would force unsafe heating, leading to carbon monoxide poisoning and other accidents. Every single place you could possibly look at, people were being screwed. And now at this point that we are talking about this, in late 2025, Tehran, the capital of the country, is literally sinking into the ground. More and more every year, destroying critical infrastructure under its own weight and lack of support. Officials are straight up preparing to abandon it. My friends, when I go and describe all this, it is not an exaggeration. It is actually not an exaggeration for me to say that Iran is legitimately collapsing. I know that is something that I put as a bit of an exaggeration in a number of YouTube episodes, so you see that in the title, but this is accurate. When I say collapsing, I'm not talking about it in the sense of, it being crushed by an outside imperial power or an internal revolution necessarily, at least for that second part, not yet. No, I am talking about a physical collapse as the state collapses in on itself and not so slowly dries out and turns to dust. It is a literal collapse that we are talking about here, one that very well could see the first water conflict in modern history take place because of it. Because Iran is not going to go down without a fight. The Helmand River, which originates in Afghanistan and flows into Iran, is a significant source of contention. Iran has long accused Afghanistan of not releasing enough water from the river, which is crucial for the Sistan and Baluchistan provinces in southeastern Iran. The lack of water has led to severe environmental degradation in the region, including the near disappearance of Lake Hamar. Iran has even threatened military action to ensure that its share of the Helmand River waters are maintained. But the Taliban has other ideas there. In another case, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which flow from Turkey through Syria and Iraq before reaching the Persian Gulf, are another major source of dispute. Turkey has built several large dams on these rivers, which have significantly reduced the water flow downstream, affecting both Iraq and Iran. Iran has expressed concerns that these dams, especially the Ilissu Dam, will further exacerbate its water shortages and environmental issues, with a reduction in water flow leading to decreased agricultural productivity and increased salinity within the soil, further straining its already tight resources. In another case, the Karun River, which we spoke about here before, that flows through Iran and forms part of its border with Iraq, that is also a point of contention. The construction of dams and irrigation projects by both countries has led to disputes over water sharing, with each side accusing the other of not adhering to agreed upon water sharing protocols. Really, as I am describing all this, if the water crisis gets bad enough, these disputes could easily escalate into full-blown armed conflict. Iran is not isolated in its problems when I describe that. It is just one of the worst examples of it. Other states are experiencing similar problems and will fight to defend their resources. Among all these potential conflicts, though, Afghanistan, under the Taliban, seems to be the most likely in my opinion. We covered that more actually in a previous video and likely have to address it here again after the issue this month between Afghanistan and Pakistan because it's a whole other thing right there. But either way, this incessant instability and suffering is something that will only fuel resentment and calls for change within society. In recent years, chronic water and electricity shortages have become powerful catalysts for protests across the Iranian state, as farmers have united with rural tribes, urban middle-class families, and even some government employees to strike out against the government. Demonstrators in the last couple of years have chanted slogans like water, electricity, life, our absolute rights, and after things got really bad and prolonged outages were taking place, literally chanting death to Khomeini or we don't want incompetent officials. Which, in Iran, that is not normally something that you are able to do, but people are growing less afraid as they are becoming more desperate. Most recently, the summer of 2025 would see new waves of demonstrations as Iranians would endure one of the hottest, driest seasons on record. In July of 2025, protests would erupt in cities including Sabzavar in northeastern Iran after days of blackouts and water cuts. Videos showing crowds on the street at night chanting, "If we don't get our rights, we won't leave," and mocking officials as shameless are pretty shocking. In response, authorities would fire tear gas and deploy anti-riot units, turning these into two-day clashes. Meanwhile, in Gilan province, which is also in the north, which usually actually would have more water, towns like Koshkabajar would see people block roads and rally outside the governor's office when faced with repeated unannounced outages, chanting slogans like death to incompetence and we don't want incompetent officials. Again, this is something that is a massive shift within Iranian society, where people would oftentimes be too afraid to speak out to now they are so desperate that they don't care anymore. This has gotten so bad that even state-linked media would acknowledge the volatility, with a Revolutionary Guard-affiliated news outlet warning in 2025 that resource shortages were, quote, fraying family life, end quote. From that, triggering local conflicts that could explode into broader unrest. As for what can actually be done about any of this, guys, there isn't really anything. The regime's typical response has been a mix of suppressing people and also providing some short-term concessions. As just an example of this, back during some of the protests, officials would sometimes release water from dams for a few days to placate farmers, which, this is something they also did in Isfahan in 2021 and 2025. Or they would temporarily shut down the crypto farms that were licensed by the government in order to say that, like, hey, look at what we're doing to fight the blackouts. Another thing that they would also do is go and announce random holidays and remote work on extreme weather days, essentially telling people to stay at home as a way to reduce demand on further resources. However, while definitely something that is done, these moves are nothing more than band-aids. The reality is here, my friends, Iran's water and power crisis is the direct result of a century of mismanagement, a century of corruption, and misplaced priorities under the clerical dictatorship. With the Revolutionary Guard profiteering through the water mafia, with reckless damming taking place, with groundwater being extracted at unprecedented rates, depleting sources, and power diversion to literal crypto farms and other heavy industries, combined with costly foreign wars, all of these things have drained the nation's lifelines, where infrastructure is crumbling. Drought and climate stress is something that has only sped up the rate of decay. This already would have been taking place, it is just worse. And when describing all that, the regime has shown itself as being completely either unwilling or incapable of doing anything to reverse these issues. Genuine reform, which is, mind you, the only thing that could actually change things in the long term, that would require dismantling the entire system that enriches and sustains the power of the current regime. That is something that is impossible as it is. And as a result, this crisis is only going to deepen. Protests are going to spread, and the rulers of the country are ultimately going to have to deal with the consequences of what they have created within the next couple of years or decades. This is not a call for simple regime change. That is not something that typically one would want to necessarily do. But genuinely, considering how the structure of Iran is set up, unless things change in rapid order, it is going to die out. Iran itself is going to disappear unless the people themselves are able to decide the course of their nation. And that, honestly, is not something that I see happening here right now. With that, my friends, on that very dark note, I'm going to be leaving you all here today. I do really appreciate you joining me for this episode. This has been something that has been deeply concerning to go and research and realize just how incredibly bad everything is. And that is not something that I particularly like. But if you like this episode and you want to see something here in the future, definitely let me know in the comment section below. Like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want early access to any of these episodes, definitely go and check out my membership. I post the audios, or if I don't get the audio, if I get the unedited video of this where it has no edits from my editor thrown up onto this days early before any of this goes out, you can check out my membership. And you can also check out Patreon, where I offer that as part of like the second tier and up. So if you want to check all that out, my friends, I'd appreciate it. But with that, I'll let you go here today. Thank you. Best of luck.